The family that disappeared. In the heart of a remote European village, shrouded in perpetual fog and steeped in superstition, lies Doncaster Manor, a decaying estate where the Doncaster family vanished without a trace. Clara, a determined outsider burdened by a mysterious past, arrives to investigate their disappearance, only to find herself ensnared in a centuries-old curse that threatens her very sanity. Chapter 1: The Arrival. Clara stepped off the creaking carriage, her boots crunching against the gravel as she took in the desolate landscape of Rovendale. The village was eerily silent, its narrow streets lined with crooked houses that seemed to lean inward, whispering secrets to one another. A chill wind swept through the square, rustling dry leaves and sending a shiver down Clara's spine. She pulled her heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the inn across the road, its windows dark and lifeless. The door creaked open before she could knock, revealing an old woman whose face was etched with years of hardship. Her eyes, sharp and wary, studied Clara for a long moment before she spoke. "You're the writer," she said, her voice rasping like sandpaper. "Come to dig up ghosts, have you?" "I'm here to uncover the truth," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "About the Doncasters." The old woman snorted, shaking her head. "Best not go looking where the dead don't rest," she muttered, stepping aside to let Clara enter. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and something more acrid, something that lingered just beneath the surface of normalcy. As Clara settled into the small room upstairs, the weight of the village's silence pressed heavily on her. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, every shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim candlelight. She tried to shake the feeling, reminding herself that this was what she had come for, a mystery, a story worth telling. But deep down, a part of her wondered if she had been foolish to think she could control what she might uncover. Chapter 2: The Manor. The next morning, Clara set out toward Doncaster Manor, the directions from the innkeeper still fresh in her mind. The path wound through a dense forest of gnarled trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The further she walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the very air carried whispers of things best left forgotten. When she finally reached the manor, it loomed before her like a sleeping beast, its once grand facade now cloaked in ivy and decay. Vines clung to the stone walls like veins, pulsing faintly in the pale light of day. The iron gates stood slightly ajar, creaking ominously as she pushed them open. Inside, the house exuded an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional groan of settling wood or the soft drip of water somewhere unseen. Mold crawled along the walls, and the faint scent of mildew mingled with something sharper, blood. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped deeper into the foyer, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust carpeting the floor. She wandered through the empty rooms, each one colder than the last. In the drawing room, she found a shattered mirror leaning precariously against the wall. Behind it, partially hidden by shards of glass, was a child's drawing, crude lines forming the shape of a boy standing in front of a red door. The paper was yellowed and brittle, yet the image seemed almost too vivid, as if it had been drawn only yesterday. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Clara turned sharply, half expecting someone, or something, to be watching her. But the room remained empty, save for the remnants of a life long gone. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Walls. That night, back in the village, Clara lay awake in her rented room, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in her mind, the eerie silence of the manor, the unsettling drawing, the strange sensation that she was being watched. Sleep eluded her, and when she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with fragmented images, shadows moving behind closed doors, whispers curling through the air like smoke, and the faint sound of sobbing echoing from somewhere deep within the house. She woke abruptly to the sound of voices. At first, she thought it was the wind again, but as she sat up, she realized the whispers were coming from the walls. They were low and unintelligible, but there was no mistaking their presence. Clara reached for the lantern on the bedside table, her hands trembling as she lit it. The flickering flame cast long shadows across the room, making the patterns on the wallpaper seem to shift and writhe. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door, slow and deliberate. Clara held her breath, listening intently. The steps stopped just beyond the threshold, and for a moment, all was silent. Then, with a soft creak, the door began to open on its own. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the widening gap. Darkness spilled into the room, and with it came a cold draft that extinguished the lantern. Clara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard as the whispers grew louder, coalescing into words she could almost understand. Clara. The voices called, barely audible but unmistakably directed at her. She buried her face in her hands, willing herself to wake up from what surely had to be a nightmare. But when she looked up again, the door was still open, and the room was colder than ever. Chapter 4, The First Vision. The following morning, Clara awoke to find herself lying in the woods behind the manor, her clothes soaked and muddy, her feet bare and bleeding. She sat up slowly, her head throbbing as memories of the previous night flooded back. Had she sleepwalked? Or had something else brought her here? The forest around her was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. As she struggled to her feet, she noticed a trail of footprints leading deeper into the trees. Against her better judgment, she followed them, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. The deeper she went, the darker it became, until even the sunlight seemed unable to penetrate the dense canopy above. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, a child's laughter, high-pitched and innocent, yet tinged with something wrong. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. From between two trees, a figure emerged, a boy, no older than 10, his eyes completely white. He smiled at her, but there was nothing friendly about it. It was the smile of someone who knew far more than he should, someone who saw right through her. Elias, Clara whispered, recognizing the name from the missing portrait she had seen in the manor. The boy tilted his head, his expression unreadable. They didn't disappear, he said softly. They were collected. Before Clara could respond, the forest around her dissolved into darkness, and she found herself waking up once again in her room at the inn, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. Chapter 5, The Villager's Silence. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara returned to the village later that day, seeking answers from the locals. But every person she approached seemed reluctant to speak, their faces clouded with fear and suspicion. Even the innkeeper, who had been somewhat accommodating, now avoided her gaze whenever possible. Frustrated, Clara sought out the village priest, Father Tomas, hoping he might offer some insight. She found him in the small chapel at the edge of town, kneeling before the altar in prayer. When he finally rose and turned to face her, his expression was grave. "You seek answers about the Doncasters," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But some truths are better left buried." Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "I need to know what happened to them," she insisted. "Why won't anyone talk about it?" Father Tomas sighed, reaching into the folds of his robe to retrieve a worn leather book. He handed it to Clara with a solemn nod. "For your soul, child," he said. "Read it before it's too late." Back in her room, Clara opened the book, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and passages written in Latin. As she flipped through the pages, a sense of unease settled over her. This was no ordinary text, it was a record of something ancient, something powerful. And as she read, she realized that the Doncaster's disappearance was only the beginning of a much darker tale. Chapter 6: The Mirror Room. With the knowledge gleaned from the priest's book, Clara returned to Doncaster Manor, determined to explore the house more thoroughly. This time, she made her way directly to the upper floors, where she remembered seeing a locked door marked only by a symbol, an eye encircled by runes. The key she had taken from the study fit perfectly, and with a click, the door swung open to reveal a room unlike any other. Inside, dozens of mirrors lined the walls, each one covered by a black cloth. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, and the temperature dropped significantly as Clara stepped inside. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully removed the cloth from the nearest mirror. At first, all she saw was her reflection, a tired, disheveled woman with haunted eyes. But as she stared, her reflection blinked while she did not. Clara stumbled back, heart racing. Was this some trick of the light? Or was something truly watching her from the other side? Summoning her courage, she moved to the next mirror, repeating the process. Each time, the same phenomenon occurred, her reflection reacting independently, mimicking her movements with slight delays or subtle variations. By the time she reached the center of the room, she felt as though she were surrounded by a dozen versions of herself, each one silently judging her presence. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the lantern she had brought with her. In the darkness, the mirrors began to glow faintly, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Clara backed away slowly, her breathing shallow, until she reached the door and fled the room, slamming it shut behind her. Chapter 7: The Portraits. Later that evening, Clara explored the east wing of the manor, where she discovered a gallery of portraits depicting the Doncaster family. Each painting was meticulously detailed, capturing the likenesses of Alastair and Eleanor Doncaster, their daughters Margaret and Lucy, and their youngest son, Elias. Yet, as she examined the frames, she noticed that one portrait was missing. The space where Elias's painting should have been was bare, the wooden frame scratched and splintered. Clara ran her fingers over the gouges, tracing the jagged edges. Etched into the wood were the words, "He never left." A chill ran down her spine. Who had carved those words, and why? Was it a warning, or a confession? She continued down the hallway, her thoughts racing. If Elias had never left, then where was he now? Had he somehow survived whatever had taken his family? Or was he still trapped within these walls, bound by whatever force had claimed the others? Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails scratching against wood. Clara froze, her ears straining to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the nursery, the room where she had found the child's drawing earlier that week. Heart pounding, she made her way to the nursery, pushing the door open with trembling hands. Inside, the room was exactly as she had left it, dusty and abandoned, save for the cradle in the corner and the music box on the shelf. But now, the tapping continued, growing louder with each passing second. Clara crossed the room cautiously, her eyes fixed on the cradle. As she reached out to touch it, the music box suddenly sprang to life, playing a haunting melody that sent shivers through her body. The tapping stopped, replaced by a single, chilling whisper. He said he'd bring them back. Chapter 8: The Crying Boy. Over the next few nights, Clara was tormented by the sound of a crying child emanating from the walls of the manor. The cries were plaintive and desperate, often accompanied by the sound of small footsteps pacing just beyond the reach of her lantern. Desperate for answers, Clara began to follow the sounds, tracing them through the labyrinthine corridors of the house. One night, the cries led her to the fireplace in the drawing room. As she leaned closer, she noticed that the bricks surrounding the hearth were loose, their mortar crumbling. With effort, she pried one free, revealing a narrow opening behind it. Beyond the hole, she could see a bricked-up doorway, its surface marred by scratches and gouges. Clara worked tirelessly to remove the remaining bricks, her hands raw from the effort. Finally, after hours of labor, the last brick gave way, and the doorway yawned open before her. Darkness spilled from the opening, thick and impenetrable. Taking a deep breath, Clara lit a new lantern and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and stifling, its walls lined with shelves of children's toys and books. A dusty cradle stood in the center, its rocking motion frozen in time. On the walls, crude drawings had been scrawled in charcoal, depicting scenes of chaos and despair. One image showed a red door, identical to the one in the child's drawing she had found weeks earlier. As Clara examined the room, the crying resumed, louder this time, as if the child were standing right beside her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Yet, the sound continued, growing in intensity until it was nearly unbearable. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The crying ceased abruptly, replaced by a single, chilling sentence. "They're waiting for you." Chapter 9, Unearthed. Clara wasted no time gathering tools from the village, bribing a few skeptical townsfolk with promises of payment and protection. Armed with picks, shovels, and a determination that bordered on obsession, she returned to the manor and set to work on the bricked-up doorway. The villagers had warned her against disturbing the past, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were hidden within those walls. It took hours of relentless effort, but eventually, the final brick fell away, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. Clara hesitated for only a moment before lighting her lantern and stepping inside. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and decay. As she moved deeper, the walls narrowed, forcing her to crouch and crawl. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small chamber carved from stone. The walls were rough-hewn, and the floor was littered with debris, broken pottery, scraps of fabric, and bones. Clara's stomach churned as she realized that these were not animal remains but human ones, scattered haphazardly across the ground. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a small, ornate box. Clara approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The box was intricately carved, its surface adorned with symbols that matched those in the priest's book. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid, revealing a collection of personal items, letters, photographs, and a small vial containing a dark, viscous liquid. As she examined the contents, a wave of nausea overtook her, and the room seemed to tilt and spin. Shadows danced along the walls, and the air grew colder with each passing second. Clara stumbled back, clutching the vial tightly as a voice whispered from the darkness. "The blood remembers. The flesh obeys." The words echoed in her mind as she fled the chamber, the vial burning against her skin like a brand. Whatever secrets the manor held, they were far darker than she had imagined, and far more dangerous. Chapter 10, The Ritual. Clara spent the following days poring over the priest's book, translating the Latin passages and piecing together fragments of information about the Doncaster's fate. The deeper she delved, the more horrifying the truth became. The Doncasters had not simply disappeared, they had been sacrificed in a ritual designed to open a gateway between worlds. According to the texts, the ritual required 3 elements: the blood of a family member, the voice of the Watcher, a malevolent entity that existed in the spaces between reality, and the sacrifice of a soul. Alistair Doncaster, driven by grief over the death of his wife, Eleanor, had performed the ritual in a desperate attempt to bring her back. But instead of saving his family, he had doomed them. Clara's hands trembled as she read the final passage, which described the consequences of the failed ritual. The Watcher had accepted the offering but demanded more. The souls of Alistair, Eleanor, Margaret, and Lucy had been taken, leaving only Elias behind. The boy had become a vessel for the Watcher, a conduit through which it could continue to feed on the living world. Clara slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. If the Watcher was still active, then it meant the danger was far from over. She needed to act quickly before it claimed another victim, perhaps even her. Chapter 11, The Seance. Determined to confront the Watcher directly, Clara prepared for a seance using the instructions outlined in the priest's book. She gathered candles, incense, and a bowl of water, arranging them in a circle on the floor of the nursery. The room was already charged with energy, and as she lit the candles, the air grew heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Clara sat cross-legged in the center of the circle, clutching the vial of dark liquid in her hand. She recited the incantation from memory, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across the walls like specters. Then, the room plunged into darkness. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging Clara into an abyss of blackness. From the corners of the room, whispers began to rise, overlapping and unintelligible. The temperature dropped dramatically, and Clara felt a presence closing in around her. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos, clear and commanding, "He took them below." Clara screamed as a sharp pain shot through her skull, and warm liquid began to trickle from her nose. She collapsed onto the floor, unconscious, the vial slipping from her grasp and rolling into the shadows. When she awoke, the room was silent once more, but something had changed. The air was different, charged with a new kind of energy, as if the house had awakened from a long slumber. Clara staggered to her feet, wiping the blood from her face, and knew that whatever she had unleashed would not be easily contained. Chapter 12, Beneath the House. The next morning, Clara awoke with a splitting headache and a lingering sense of dread. Her body ached, and her mind was foggy, but she knew she couldn't afford to waste time. The Watcher had spoken during the seance, mentioning below. If she wanted answers, she would have to go there. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, Clara returned to the nursery, where she began searching for a trapdoor or hidden entrance that might lead to the underground chamber mentioned in the ritual. After several minutes of inspecting the floor, she noticed a faint outline near the cradle, just enough to suggest that something lay beneath. Using the crowbar, Clara pried at the boards, wincing as they creaked and groaned in protest. Finally, with a loud snap, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Clara hesitated only briefly before descending into the depths of the manor. The stairs spiraled downward, disappearing into the gloom. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough stone walls and the occasional cobweb clinging to the edges of the passage. As she reached the bottom, Clara found herself in a vast underground chamber, its walls lined with carvings and symbols that matched those in the priest's book. The floor was uneven, littered with debris and bones, some small, some large. She knelt to examine one of the smaller skulls, her stomach churning as she realized they belonged to children. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Surrounding it were the names of the Doncaster family, painstakingly carved into the walls. All except one, Elias's. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she traced the letters of Alastair and Eleanor's names, wondering how many others had suffered the same fate. The Watcher's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that the ritual was incomplete, that the debt had yet to be paid. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and a low rumble reverberated through the chamber. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight beam swinging wildly as shadows danced along the walls. Something was stirring below, something ancient and hungry. She turned to flee, but the staircase had vanished, leaving only a gaping void behind. The Watcher was awake, and it was waiting. Chapter 13, Elias. Trapped in the subterranean chamber, Clara felt the cold stone beneath her palms as she steadied herself. The air was thick with tension, vibrating with an unseen force. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting as if alive. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, Clara thought it was a trick of the light, but as the beam caught the outline, she realized it was a boy, small, frail, and pale. His eyes were wide and hollow, reflecting the dim glow of the flashlight. "Elias?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The boy nodded, his lips parting slightly as if he were about to speak. But instead of words, a low, guttural growl emanated from his throat, sending a shiver down Clara's spine. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "I'm here to help." Elias tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Help," he repeated, his voice distant and layered, as if multiple echoes were speaking through him. "There is no help. Only hunger." Clara swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Your family, they were taken, weren't they? I can stop it." Elias's expression shifted, a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, crossing his features. "They didn't leave," he murmured, his voice quieter now. "They were collected." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, stepping closer. Elias's gaze hardened, his tone turning ominous. "The Watcher feeds on sorrow. It thrives on loss. My father thought he could bring my mother back, but he only fed the beast." Clara's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "And you?" she asked. "Why are you still here?" Elias looked down at his hands, which trembled slightly. "I was spared," he said bitterly. "Because I am its vessel. Its voice. Its eyes." Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the boy, trapped in a role he never asked for. "There has to be a way to break the curse," she said desperately. "To free you." Elias shook his head. "No one escapes the Watcher. It is eternal. But what if we close the gate?" Clara persisted. "What if we sever its connection to this world?" Elias looked up at her, his hollow eyes narrowing. "You would have to take my place," he said quietly. "Only then can the Watcher be sealed again." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Take your place." Elias nodded solemnly. "Sacrifice yourself. Become its vessel." Only then will the hunger cease. The weight of his words settled over Clara like a suffocating blanket. Could she really give up everything, her life, her future, for the sake of breaking a curse that had already consumed so many? Elias's expression softened, as if sensing her turmoil. "If you see the red door," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper, "run." Before Clara could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again, and the shadows began to swirl, coalescing into a form that loomed in the darkness. The Watcher was stirring, and it was aware of their conversation. Chapter 14, The Red Door. Clara stumbled back as the shadows writhed and twisted, forming a shape that seemed to stretch and contract like a living thing. The air in the chamber grew heavier, pressing against her chest as if the very walls were closing in. She could feel the Watcher's presence intensifying, its hunger palpable in the darkness. Then, as if summoned by her thoughts, a faint glow appeared at the far end of the chamber. Clara squinted, her flashlight beam cutting through the swirling shadows. There, embedded in the stone wall, was a door, its surface a deep, blood-red hue that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "The red door," Clara whispered, recalling Elias's warning. Her pulse quickened, but curiosity warred with fear. She had come too far to turn back now. Steeling herself, she took a tentative step forward, her boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor. As she approached the door, the temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the stone. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the smooth surface of the door. It was warm, unnaturally so, like the skin of a feverish creature. Behind her, the shadows surged, whispering in a cacophony of voices. Clara turned her head, catching glimpses of shifting figures in the periphery of her vision. The Watcher was close, its presence looming like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. Taking a deep breath, Clara placed both hands on the door and pushed. It resisted at first, groaning in protest, but then, with a sudden jolt, it swung inward, revealing a pitch-black void beyond. A rush of icy air hit her face, carrying with it the scent of decay and something metallic, blood. Clara hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the threshold. Instantly, the chamber behind her vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of darkness. The walls seemed to press in on her, narrowing with each step she took. The floor beneath her feet was slick, and she slipped, catching herself against the wall. Her hand came away coated in something wet and sticky. Holding it up to the dim light filtering from the cracks in the stone, she realized it was blood, fresh and glistening. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to keep moving. The corridor stretched on indefinitely, the air thick with the sound of distant whispers and the occasional echo of footsteps. Clara strained to listen, trying to discern whether they were approaching or receding, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a vast room, its dimensions impossible to gauge in the darkness. In the center, a single light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The floor was littered with objects, personal belongings, photographs, and fragments of furniture, all seemingly untouched by time. Clara stepped forward cautiously, her breath hitching as she recognized one of the items, a child's toy, identical to the one she had seen in the nursery above. Her heart pounded as she picked it up, examining the intricate details. It was pristine, as if it had been preserved in this place for decades. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Clara turned, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. In the farthest corner, a figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette that seemed to flicker and distort, as though it were composed of smoke and ash. "Clara," the figure whispered, its voice a blend of countless tones, some familiar and others alien. "You've come back." Clara's grip tightened on the toy as she took a step back. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, its form solidifying into something more recognizable, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "I am the Watcher," it said, its voice resonating through the room like thunder. "And you are mine." Clara's breath caught in her throat as the realization struck her. This was the entity that had claimed the Doncasters, the force that had kept Elias trapped in this cursed existence. She had to escape, had to find a way to seal the Watcher away before it claimed her too. But as she turned to flee, the walls began to shift, the corridor collapsing inward. The red door was gone, and Clara was trapped in the heart of the Watcher's domain, with nowhere left to run. Chapter 15, The Bargain. Clara's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she backed away from the Watcher's shifting form. The air in the chamber was thick with an oppressive weight, and every heartbeat thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the entity's gaze boring into her, peeling back layers of her mind like parchment. "You've come to complete what was begun," the Watcher intoned, its voice reverberating through the stone walls. "The ritual demands balance. Blood remembers. Flesh obeys." Clara clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain standing despite the overwhelming dread pressing against her ribs. "You took them," she spat. "You promised to bring them back, but you devoured them instead." The Watcher tilted its head, the motion eerily fluid, like oil spilling across a surface. "They were offered. Their father's grief made them ripe for consumption." Clara's stomach twisted. Alistair thought he could bring Eleanor back, she murmured, the realization dawning like a terrible weight. "Instead, he gave you his entire family." A chuckle, low and grating, escaped the Watcher's lips. "He believed in love stronger than death. But death does not bargain. Death only takes." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. "Then why spare Elias?" The Watcher's form flickered, momentarily distorting like a flame caught in a gust of wind. "Because he was the key. The last tether between this world and the one beyond. Through him, I remain." Clara swallowed hard. "And me?" The Watcher stepped closer, its presence warping the air around it. "You carry the bloodline. You are the heir to the Doncasters' legacy. Your arrival was foreseen." Clara's knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to stay upright. "Then tell me," she demanded, voice shaking but resolute, "how do I end this?" The Watcher's lips curled into something resembling amusement. "By becoming what he was. By taking his place." A cold shudder ran through Clara's spine. "You want me to be your vessel?" To seal the gate, the Watcher confirmed, a sacrifice must be made. Another must take the role of the Watcher's voice. The cycle continues unless the chain is broken. Clara's mind raced. She had read of such rituals, of spirits bound to vessels, of curses passed down through generations. If she refused, the Watcher would remain, feeding on the sorrow of those who dared to enter Doncaster Manor. If she accepted, she would become something else entirely, no longer Clara Voss, but a prison for something ancient and ravenous. The Watcher extended a skeletal hand. "Choose." Chapter 16, The Inheritance. Clara hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. The Watcher's outstretched hand hovered between them, a grotesque invitation. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, centuries of suffering, of families torn apart, of lives stolen in exchange for a power that should never have been tampered with. You hesitate, the watcher observed, its voice dripping with amusement. Perhaps you already suspect the truth. Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing through the fragments of knowledge she had gathered. The priest's warnings, the journal's cryptic entries, the whispers in the walls, they had all pointed to something larger than the Doncaster's tragedy. Something deeply personal. You knew I would come, she said slowly, realization dawning like a cold fire in her chest. You've been waiting for me. The watcher inclined its head. Blood remembers, it whispered. Flesh obeys. Clara took a shaky step back, her thoughts unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. She had always known there was something strange about her family, unexplained absences, whispered stories never fully told. Now, the truth clawed its way to the surface. I'm not just a descendant, she breathed. I'm the last link in the chain. The watcher's form flickered, its grin widening. Yes, it hissed. The final heir of the Doncasters. The last blood to spill. The final voice to carry my will. Clara's breath came in short, ragged gasps. She had spent her life chasing stories, unraveling mysteries, but never had she imagined she was part of one. Never had she thought that her fate had been decided long before she was born. A voice from behind her snapped her out of her trance. Clara. She turned sharply. Elias stood in the shadows, his hollow eyes filled with something that almost resembled pity. You were always meant to return, he said softly. This house, it waits for us. Clara's throat tightened. I don't want this. Elias stepped forward, his small frame trembling. None of us did. The watcher laughed, a sound like nails scraping against stone. But you will accept it. Because there is no escape. Clara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. There has to be another way. Elias met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Maybe there is. The watcher's laughter ceased instantly. You dare defy me? Elias turned to face the entity, his posture stiff with defiance. I was your prisoner for too long. But she doesn't belong to you. The watcher's form writhed, its outlines distorting violently. You cannot break the bond. Elias raised his chin. She can. Clara's heart pounded. How? Elias stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Seal the gate. End the cycle. But you have to choose, before it chooses for you. The watcher roared, its form expanding like a tidal wave of shadow. You will not escape me. Clara's breath hitched. The choice lay before her, stark and undeniable. Blood remembers. Flesh obeys. But Clara Voss was not done fighting. Not yet. Chapter 17, The Shifting House. The moment Clara made her decision, the house reacted. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the halls of Doncaster Manor, as if the very foundation of the structure had exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. The walls trembled, the floorboards creaked, and the air grew thick with something unseen yet undeniably present. Upstairs, the villagers of Rovendale stirred from uneasy sleep, their nightmares interrupted by the unnatural vibrations seeping through the land. Some bolted upright in bed, clutching their blankets as they listened to the distant sound of the house shifting, rearranging itself like a monstrous puzzle finding its final pieces. Others simply stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move, knowing that whatever was happening in the manor was beyond mortal understanding. Within the house itself, Clara felt the change immediately. The corridor she had entered moments ago no longer led where it had before. Doors that had been sealed for decades creaked open, revealing rooms that should not have existed. Hallways twisted upon themselves, looping back to places she had already passed. Time distorted, seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. The air pulsed with an unseen rhythm, as though the house were alive, breathing in tandem with the entity that had claimed it. Elias stayed close beside her, his small frame tense. "It knows," he whispered. "It's trying to stop you." Clara swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight in her trembling hands. "Then we don't have much time." They pressed forward, navigating the ever-changing layout of the manor. What had once been a grand staircase now led to a narrow passage lined with mirrors, each one cracked, each one reflecting something different. In one, Clara saw herself as she was, pale and wide-eyed. In another, she saw herself as a shadowy figure, her features blurred, her eyes glowing with unnatural light. A third mirror showed her standing alone in the manor, surrounded by darkness, her reflection smiling at her with a knowing smirk. "Don't look at them," Elias warned, tugging at her sleeve. "They show what could be, not what is." Clara tore her gaze away, forcing herself to focus on the path ahead. The house was resisting her, trying to confuse her, to make her lose her way. But she couldn't afford hesitation. The Watcher was stirring, and if she didn't act soon, the opportunity to end this would vanish forever. They reached the great hall, where the massive double doors that led to the central staircase stood slightly ajar. Beyond them, the stairway spiraled upward into darkness. But something was wrong. The banisters were warped, twisted into grotesque shapes. The portraits hanging along the walls had changed, faces melted into grotesque expressions, mouths open in silent screams. Clara stepped forward, but the floor beneath her shifted. She stumbled, barely catching herself before she fell. The rug beneath her feet rippled like water disturbed by an unseen current. "This isn't just a house anymore," she murmured. "It's something else." Elias nodded grimly. "It's becoming what it was always meant to be." Above them, a door slammed shut with a deafening crack. Then another. And another. The house was sealing itself, locking them inside. Clara's pulse pounded. There was no turning back now. Chapter 18, Into the Red Door. The red door loomed before Clara, its surface pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. The air around it was thick, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to turn away and never look back. But she knew there was no escaping this. The house had led her here for a reason. Elias stood beside her, his small frame rigid with tension. "Once you step through," he whispered, "there's no coming back." Clara exhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady her nerves. "I don't intend to come back." She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the smooth, blood-red surface of the door. It was warm, too warm, like it had been waiting for her. Waiting for this moment. With a final breath, she pushed it open. The world beyond the threshold was not what she expected. There was no immediate horror, no monstrous figure waiting to devour her. Instead, she found herself standing in a version of Doncaster Manor that was both familiar and utterly wrong. The walls were pristine, untouched by time. The furniture gleamed as if newly polished. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting golden beams across the polished floorboards. For a fleeting moment, it was as if the house had never fallen into ruin. And then she saw them. The Doncasters. Alistair and Eleanor stood in the parlor, their backs to her. Margaret and Lucy sat at the piano, their fingers poised over the keys. The house was frozen in a perfect, eerie stillness, as if caught between moments. Clara's breath hitched. Is this real? Elias stepped beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. It's a memory. A fragment of what was. She took a hesitant step forward. The moment her foot touched the floor, the illusion shattered. A scream tore through the air, one of pure terror. The piano crashed to the floor, its keys scattering like bones. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Shadows erupted from the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. The Doncasters turned. Their faces were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking like marionettes on invisible strings. Clara stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. What is this? Elias grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. It's the moment they were taken. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around the Doncasters like tendrils of ink. Their screams grew louder, more desperate, but no matter how hard they fought, they were pulled deeper into the darkness. Alistair turned his head, his hollow gaze locking onto Clara. You were always meant to finish this, he rasped. Then he vanished, swallowed by the abyss. Lucy reached out, her fingers stretching impossibly long. Help us, she pleaded. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. She wanted to help them, to pull them back, to undo what had been done. But she knew it was impossible. These were only echoes, trapped in the moment of their demise. Elias tugged at her arm. We have to go. Clara nodded, tearing her gaze away from the fading figures. She turned, but the door behind her was gone. The walls were closing in, the shadows creeping forward with deliberate intent. The Watcher was waiting. Chapter 19, The Final Choice. Clara stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the shadows closed in around her. The remnants of the Doncasters' final moments faded into the void, leaving only darkness and the oppressive weight of the Watcher's presence. Elias remained at her side, his small frame trembling. We don't have much time, he whispered urgently. It knows what you're planning. Clara's fingers curled into fists. Then let it come. A low, guttural chuckle echoed through the void, reverberating through the very air around them. You think you can defy me? The Watcher hissed, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones, whispers of the dead, echoes of those it had claimed. You are merely another link in the chain. Clara squared her shoulders, forcing her fear into submission. Not anymore. The shadows surged forward, writhing like living things. Clara barely had time to react before Elias threw himself between her and the advancing darkness. His small form glowed faintly, as if some remnant of his humanity still burned within him. They begged me to forget them, Elias said, his voice steady despite the terror around them. But I couldn't. I was their prison, their witness. But now I want to be free. Clara's heart clenched. Elias. He turned to her, his hollow eyes filled with something almost like hope. You can end this, he said. You can take my place. Seal the gate. Break the cycle. The Watcher's form materialized from the shadows, towering over them like a monolith of despair. You cannot escape what was destined, it intoned, its voice dripping with malice. The blood remembers. The flesh obeys. Clara stepped forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I'm not afraid of you." The Watcher's laughter was like 1,000 nails scraping against stone. "You should be." The shadows lashed out, striking at Clara with unnatural speed. She barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side as the tendrils of darkness sliced through the air where she had stood. Elias darted forward, placing himself between her and the entity once more. "I won't let you take her," he declared, his voice stronger than Clara had ever heard it. The Watcher recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You dare defy me?" Elias met its gaze without flinching. "I was your prisoner for too long. But she is not yours." Clara seized the moment, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out the vial of dark liquid she had taken from the hidden chamber. The Watcher's attention snapped to it instantly, its form convulsing with rage. "No," it shrieked. "You cannot use that." Clara tightened her grip on the vial, her mind racing. The priest's book had hinted at a way to sever the Watcher's hold, an offering of blood, a final sacrifice. But she wasn't sure if it would work. Elias turned to her, his expression resolute. "Do it," he urged. "End this." Clara hesitated for only a moment before uncorking the vial. The liquid inside shimmered like oil in moonlight, thick and unnatural. She could feel its power radiating from it, a dark promise of what was to come. The Watcher lunged, its form distorting violently. "You will not betray me." Clara acted on instinct. She hurled the vial toward the entity, the liquid bursting in midair like a splash of ink. The moment it touched the Watcher, the entire room erupted in a blinding flash of light. A scream, inhuman, agonizing, split the air as the entity writhed, its form unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the void as the Watcher's presence began to dissolve. Elias cried out as the force of the explosion knocked Clara backward. She landed hard on the cold stone floor, her vision swimming as the darkness around her began to lift. The Watcher's voice echoed one last time, a whisper of fury and desperation. "This is not the end." Then, silence. Clara pushed herself up, her body aching, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was no longer shifting. The shadows had vanished. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house was gone. Elias stood before her, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. His hollow eyes met hers, and for the first time, they were filled with peace. "You did it," he murmured. Clara's throat tightened. "You're free." Elias smiled faintly. "Thank you." His form began to fade, dissolving into motes of light that drifted upward, vanishing into the air. The house trembled one last time, as if exhaling a breath it had been holding for centuries. Clara stood alone in the empty chamber, the echoes of the past fading into silence. The curse was broken. But at what cost? Chapter 20, The Disappearance. The villagers of Rovendale awoke to an eerie stillness. The wind had ceased its mournful wail through the trees, and the oppressive fog that had clung to the village for generations had lifted, revealing a sky so blue it seemed unnatural. Birds chirped for the first time in years, and the scent of spring blossoms drifted through the air, replacing the ever-present stench of damp earth and decay. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound serenity, an unshakable unease settled over the people of Rovendale. The Doncaster Manor, once a looming, rotting relic of a forgotten tragedy, was gone. Where the house had stood, there was now only an expanse of untouched grass, as if it had never existed at all. Marta, the old innkeeper, was the first to notice. She stood at her window, peering through the early morning haze, her wrinkled brow furrowing in confusion. "It's gone," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "The house, it's gone." Word spread quickly through the village. No one dared venture too close to the empty space where the manor had once stood. Superstition still clung to the people like a second skin, and though the air was lighter, the memory of what had transpired within those walls remained etched in their minds. Father Tomas arrived at the site shortly after dawn, his rosary clutched tightly in his hands. He knelt in the grass, running his fingers through the dew-covered blades. There was no sign of struggle, no remnants of the house, only silence. And then he saw it. Half buried in the soil was a small leather-bound journal, its cover weathered and stained with age. He lifted it carefully, brushing away the dirt before opening it to the final page. The handwriting was neat, precise, but the ink was dark, almost black. As if it had been written in something other than ink. The final entry read, "I am the house now." Father Tomas exhaled sharply, closing the book with trembling hands. He looked up at the sky, where the sun shone brighter than it had in decades. And somewhere, deep within the earth, the house waited. Forever.